So it's being filmed. I wear black. Black hides a multitude of sins. And part of my brand is to wear the hat. Now, you know, if I do that, it might get a bit shiny, but I will take it off, okay? What I'm going to do today is do a presentation, not the usual thing I do, because sometimes it's blue sky and how good the region is, and the region's good, but I'm going to do a more balancing act. This came about because I've written a series of things over the years, particularly in recent times, about the challenges and what I call ground truthing through something called the Matusik missive. If you don't know what that is, I've got a business card on that corner there. Go to my website, it's free to join, and I write something each week. And in this case, I wrote about the challenges facing Southeast Queensland, and particularly in terms of its next growth phase and whether or not the land and so forth that's needed to do that is really there. So today I'm going to talk about a range of things. I'm going to start with a helicopter, and I'm going to talk about the market and the cycle and all the things you read about in the paper and see on TV and how we're all going to, you know, have prices fall 30, 40%. Poppycock. It's not going to happen unless we have a major economic collapse, and we wouldn't be parking our cars outside if we'd be doing that. We'd all be eating 4 servings of breakfast, okay? So I'm going to talk about that and where things are happening and aren't happening. I'm going to then step back and take a look at who lives in what and who buys what. So I'm going to talk about the house market, the townhouse market, and the apartment market. Because a lot of people don't understand who buys that stock, who lives in it. I'm funneling them down into 5 trends. I like to number things. 5 trends that are happening in the property market in the Moreton Bay area, and then 5 development trends that are happening in this area too. And then there is a mismatch, and a mismatch coming between what the market wants and how products delivered here and what's available. And there's constraints to that. Some of it's physical, some of it is just the process. We get that right, this area is going to have the future as it has in the past. We don't, and then this area is likely to slow down and see growth take place elsewhere. Some might not like the growth as it's happened, traffic, so forth. But with that comes a lot of jobs. With that comes affordability. With that also comes employment. So we'll talk about those things. Happy with that? Now we have to be I'm getting old, so occasionally I have this nasal drip. I know it sounds really bad. I'll just go like this a few times today, okay? Apologise. We also have to get out of here by 8:30, so I'm going to try and keep this within an hour, maybe a little less, and some questions afterwards. I'll be over behind us outside for more questions if need be, because bingo's important, and when the ladies come in here, we don't want to be in here, okay? So we're going to... I'm not having a go, it's important to them. So we're going to be out of here by then. Happy with that? Okay. So Sydney and Melbourne are overcooked, okay? They oversupplied themselves, they did, they built too much stock, and they had overseas buying that generated prices beyond the local market's capacity. That's largely what drove Sydney and Melbourne's house markets, up to a peak to 2016, and is now coming back. We didn't do that, we had a slow burn increase. The reason it didn't happen here is we didn't have particularly, this is not a xenophobic comment, this is what's happened. We didn't have people, particularly from China, not only, but particularly from outbidding each other at auction. We didn't have capital flight. We didn't have people trying to buy their future passport. Some of it legal, much of it illegal. We didn't have that here. And then in part of that, what happened in Sydney, Melbourne, and I witnessed it firsthand many times in 2014, 15, 16, when I was there doing presentations, that there was FOMO, fear of missing out. So the local investors were paying $1 million for things that really should have paid 600 or 650. They're going through a correction. Other places in Australia aren't. Now there is a cycle and it does repeat, and there's usually what I call factor X's that affect the cycle. This year's a year of 2 halves. We have a federal election. It will be close. We may see a change. And that's stopped a lot of things. We have APRA putting their foot on the neck too hard, and they're going to release that. I do believe that interest rates will fall, cash rate will fall, to keep things where they are. The second half of this year could be a lot better than the beginning of this year, even if there's a change of government. So there's always factors there. So some of the stuff I'm going to talk about next are long-term trends. I just don't want to focus on the last 6 months have been very hard, Michael, and they've been worse than the previous 6 months. Yes, okay, that happens in the cycle, but we want to talk broad trends and wider potential. Okay, happy with that? Now, one of the things that's facing southeast Queensland is an increase in demand. That increases by population growth. Some of it's from interstate, some of it from overseas, and some of it's just people having children. And we're all living a little longer. Well, many of us would like to live a little longer, and a lot of us are. And one thing that's counterbalancing that is there is a real limit to supply. Yes, there's been oversupplies in inner Brisbane in terms of the apartment market. There isn't now, because that market's contracted and stopped. The economics of delivering a townhouse project, and especially an apartment project, is very hard. In fact, they don't stack up a lot of times. Most of my day-to-day work is consulting work, advising on individual projects. Most of that work in the last year or two, and in fact, many of the jobs that we're quoting on at the moment, is to fix apartment and townhouse projects. Some of them can't be fixed. They can't change the product, they can't change the price points. They've paid too much for the sites and so forth. Some don't want to go back to council. In some councils, that's understandable. And so they sit there, and that's dried up the market. Why it's dried it up is the sales aren't there, the investors aren't there. And with negative gearing goes, that will affect particularly those apartment and some degree townhouse markets for some time. Okay? So that's a challenge for southeast Queensland, and it's a big challenge for this region. Is the land available in the right configurations, by the right ownerships, with the right infrastructure, with the right densities, with the right planning outcomes to provide for the demand? Big question mark. The work I've done, and it's a lot of work, suggests that it isn't, and strongly suggests that it isn't. Let's just position where the markets are, because people like to do this. So the market, the property cycle runs for about 7-8 years from peak to peak, or trough to trough, okay? So it takes about 7 or so years, 7-8 years to run that cycle. Might move my little table. And in that phase of the 7 years, there's a recovery, an upturn, a downturn, and stagnation, okay? And that's a peak and a trough. The media like to call that a boom and a bust, okay? Let's make this really easy because it's Wednesday, it's going to rain. Yes, we need it to rain today. A bit slow. Well, I'm a bit slow. This is spring, this is summer, this is autumn, and this is winter. Very easy. Warm, hot, cooling, cold. Not equidistant, we won't get into that, okay? Certain markets are certain places. So if I use the red pen to show where the detached house markets are, and I'm only going to make a couple of big ones this morning. Melbourne and Sydney are there. So they're going through a downturn and they're going to enter a stagnation. They may fall a little bit more in value, but don't believe that people are losing 15-20% of value of their properties in Melbourne or Sydney, as often talked about, and they could lose another 10-15%. That's if they bought in the peak in 2016 and paid top dollar, they might see that go back 20 to 30%. But most people, even people who bought in 2016, weren't foolish enough to pay those top dollars. And people who bought a decade ago or 2 decades ago, they've probably made 2 or 3 times their money on their property. So this is what the media does. Sydney and Melbourne are going through that correction. I think they're nearly there. And then they'll sit there. They'll wait a cycle, as has happened in Gladstone, the Gold Coast and other places in the past. Brisbane's here. Why? For houses? Because demand exceeds supply. Right now, yes, there's a new housing stock sitting around that may not be moving as fast as it once was, but I believe that post the election and into next year and the year after that, they will start to sell again and quite quickly. Moreton Bay is here in terms of housing market. Now, if I was to draw where the townhouse and unit markets are in a blue pen, Sydney and Melbourne are in about the same spot. Inner Brisbane is here, because people want to know that. 5k radius from GPO. That's gone through its correction. It's going to sit there for quite a period of time. And also in Moreton Bay is around this area, so it's starting to go through a downturn. The reason being is the demand for that product, particularly apartments and to some degree townhouses, is nowhere near as strong as the demand for detached housing. And that's going to actually continue to be the case in the next 5 to 10 years, and we'll get to why. So unless we provide the right amount of stock to cater for the growth, what's going to happen is this area is going to suffer from a couple of things. It's going to suffer from jobs. Why? 12% of all jobs here are directly related to construction. That's 1 in 8, and 1 in 4, 25%, are directly and indirectly because somebody builds something. So the local jobs here are largely that. Yes, a lot of people drive early in the morning, down to Brisbane and so forth. Some do construction jobs there, but a lot of people are involved there. And that's just maybe a stat that I understand and clean up each time. So jobs are important. Housing affordability is important. Okay, so you need to afford the housing. And the other thing as a result of that is economic growth. So those couple of things, if we don't get it right, the growth will go elsewhere. And the land is more readily available, whilst only in a couple of providers on the Sunshine Coast, Logan, Ipswich, even the Gold Coast, not so much in Brisbane. And you could say, well, I'd rather live in Moreton than I'd live in Ipswich. See, I nearly said yes, because I might have to go to Ipswich and deliver a presentation soon. That's up to the beholder, but people will move, particularly from interstate, where the opportunities are for work and where the price is right and where the jobs are. Okay? That's what happens. So these are challenges for us. Happy with that? Can I keep it going? Now, I've prepared one previously, as they say in the cooking shows, so I'll just turn this over. This is normally when it all stuffs up and I can't turn the damn thing over. Got this on camera, you ready? I don't use PowerPoint because I think most people go to sleep. I go to sleep. So bear with me. This is the next section, so it's part 2 of my talk today, is about who lives in what, who buys what, to understand that. And I'm going to build on this when we talk about the Moreton region next. So if I was to say houses, townhouses and apartments, 3 simple products. So a detached product, these 2 are attached, but typical townhouse and typical apartment. If I was to say how many of those people are owner-occupiers who live in this product, 25% are actually owner-occupiers for houses. So 75%, sorry. 25% are investors. In townhouses, it's usually 50-50. So 50% owner-occupiers and 50% are investors. So this is an investor when I'm writing blue. And then in apartments, only 25% are owner-occupiers and 75% are investors. So when the investment market slows down, for a range of reasons, interest rates rise, it's hard to get finance, they don't see there's growth, there's an oversupply, there's a myriad of things, that actually slows down, and less for apartment sales. Most buyers for houses are local. They come from the local area, often only a couple of suburbs removed, if not the same suburb. So 20% are from far away, okay, far away. About 60% are locals in townhouses and 40% from far away. And for apartments, only 20% are locals and about 80% are actually from far away, often from interstate. Nothing wrong with interstate investment, but that's what happens. Now, the driver behind a lot of those investors are negative gearing, but it's only 20% for houses generally, it's 50% for townhouses, and it's 85% plus for apartments. So one of the things that is likely to happen if negative gearing is removed from established properties, as the apartment markets, when they come to resell, will take a kick in price downwards, and you will see more, I believe, new builds, because negative gearing will be allowed for new builds, but you'll see it mainly in houses, some degree townhouses, and they'll be where you can have dual occupancies. That's increasing in demand, or dual plus occupancies. That's what an investor will look for. And owner-occupiers want that as well, but that's a different event. Maybe in question time we can talk about that. Now, on average, there's 3.5 people per house, 2.2 people per townhouse, and 1.4 persons in an apartment. The yield range, when I look at it properly, per hectare, okay, when I actually cut out the roads and the parks and do it over a series of developments over time, you'll find that it's 15 to 20, 25 to 30 for townhouses and 55 to 60 for apartments. Yes, there's examples where there's 100 apartments on a site like that, but there's examples when there's 25. So the average is that. When I combine those two, the density, the number of people per hectare is 55 to 70, 55 to 65, and 75 to 85. One of the first points I want to make is that in the planning sphere, and I'm a qualified town planner with first class honours with a string of awards, so I can say some things about planning. Whilst I might not practice per se, I know about planning. Work a lot with planners. A lot of the conversation is about dwellings per hectare. Wrong conversation, in my opinion. It should be people per hectare. We're accommodating people. This result is very good. There's more people per house. There's less people per property, you get less. If the market's there for that, yes. But if the market's dominant wanting this, the outcome's pretty good. The prices, this is a typical range from this area for new property, 450 to 500, 400 to 425, 375 to 425. That's for new stock. There's property outside of those borders, but let's just for today get it on one board. Average size 225, 135, 100 square metres. A lot of people don't downsize, for argument's sake, from a house to an apartment. Why? They can't put their stuff in it. Who's going to get rid of their car? Who's going to get rid of that lounge? Who's going to throw their golf clubs out? Well, at least put them somewhere where they trip over them every day. Those type of things are real life things. So there's a couple of observations here. One is to do with the density. Second is to do with the price. And the third is that this type of stock, particularly houses, to some degree townhouses, cater for local demand. Happy with that? Shall we move forward? Let's talk about this region. Any debates? Anybody want to throw anything at me? You can't debate it yet, but you can throw something at me. Okay. I need to switch this over. Well, no I don't. I can clean it here. Bear with me. One good thing about the way I do these type of things is you get to see my best side, okay? My best feature, which is my back, okay? So that's funny. Come on, laugh. Don't just fall asleep. Not all serious. I know it's morning and everything else, but come on. Now, if I took my shirt off, that would be really scary because I've got more hair on my back than my head, but, you know. And it's grey as well. That's okay. The music usually starts normally when I finish, but, you know. Is that something in here or is that outside? Or okay. I'll talk louder. Is that better? Now let me talk about 5 things. I'll use this pen. 5 things that are happening in the real estate market here. I mean, if you're going to play music, play Springsteen or something, okay? At least we can understand the words. Okay, let's talk about population growth. I've got to look at some notes, okay, because I've been guilty recently of doing a presentation on the Gold Coast and we're using Sunshine Coast figures because they're in my head. So I've got to look at a little bit at some notes. At the moment, your area is growing by 11,000 new people per annum, okay? That does mean a lot of cars, but that also is opportunity in terms of people in the room supplying that market. There's a need, therefore, to build 4,000 new dwellings per year, based just on the number of people on average per house. One of the things that's forecast in the next 10 years, so this was the last 10 years, this is the next 10 years, that's expected to drop to about 9.6 thousand per annum, and that would be about 3.5 new homes that need to be built each year. The reason that's expected to drop is not only just the demographic makeup of the area, but the fact that the land supply is potentially not there to accommodate for the growth. Most other areas in this location, so the surrounding shires of Brisbane and even the outlying suburbs of Brisbane, are expected to see a lift in their population growth and dwelling demand, not a decline. Maybe you want a decline, maybe you want breathing space, but it's generally in business, that's not a good thing. First observation. The second is if we look at the demographics of the market and I break them down, and here I like to do this by simple things, by people do things in groups, so first home buyers do things in groups. People who are upgrading, buying a bigger property and so forth, have teenage children in their house and they've got to get them over there, so they buy a bigger property and so forth. They could just, send them off to boarding school, but they don't. Then downsizers do certain things a certain way, young renters, so forth. So the major growth markets in this area for the next 10 years, so 10 years plus, are first home buyers, upgraders, downsizers, and I'll put young renters here. Let's make sure I get the right figures. 25% 30%, what is it? Yes, 20%, and I'll leave this one off for the minute. So of the growth from where it is today to what it's supposed to be in 10 years' time, the growth's largely going to be in first home buyers, people upgrading. Normally people who upgrade want to sell the house that's on a smaller lot and buy a bigger lot, or a smaller house and a bigger house. And then downsizers. If they can provide the right stock and find the right stock at the right price point, and that has to be 20, 30% less than their house, then they'll downsize into it. It's not only a townhouse, small lot, and particularly housing works. And young renters are only going to increase by 5%. So what normally drives the house market, the demand for detached houses, is these two markets. They're big markets. What drives apartments particularly, or a lot of townhouse markets, are young renters or blue-collar workers. They're very small in growth. When I see that, and there's a lot of apartments, they normally don't work very well. That's coming here. This is the driver. There is a need for houses, and particularly detached houses. We'll get to the type of houses soon. Jobs. Just make a little bit of room here. Let's talk about jobs. There's expected to be 13,000 new jobs per annum over the next 5 years in this area. Per annum? Yes. That sounds great, fantastic, but that's 9% of SEQ's total. This area at the moment is creating about 15% right now. Part of that is the dropping of growth, part of that is to do with some of the demographics, but there's an expectation there. More development, more housing being built, that would lift. And I've done a lot of work to see when housing starts fall, job prospects, job growth falls about a year to 2 years later. And that's definitely the work that I've done here is a very clear pattern. When housing commencements fall, not so much approvals, but actually houses being delivered, that has an impact. So jobs are likely to do that. I just said before in the introduction, 12% are involved in construction and 24 to 25% are involved in construction, plus ancillary things, real estate, some solicitors' work, town planning, so on and so forth. So a quarter of the work up here is because somebody's building something, and most of the things built are residential dwellings. So that has an impact. Keep going. One of the things that's happening here in real estate is that you're seeing house prices go up, you're seeing attached prices fall. So houses went up about 2% last year, which isn't bad, given that some places they're falling from the previous year. This dropped about 6%. And if I look at the rental market, houses went up on average for $10 per week, and attached product fell by $5 a week. Okay? That would normally tell me that this market's in demand and the supply's constrained, and this market's demand is less than its supply. Simple as that. The last thing I want to mention is the I'll change it off, is the land market before we get into some development trends. So we look at the land market, what's happened here, which is somewhat common across southeast Queensland, is we've seen the size of the blocks fall from about 650 square metres to 410 square metres. This was 10 years ago, this is now, metres squared. And we've seen the price rise from $390 per square metre for a block of land to about $640 per square metre. So we've seen that happen. That is not only just a reflection of development greed. Some people say, oh, that's because they're really greedy and they want to make small lots and charge per square metre. That's to do with demand. But it's also, this price growth is also to do with limitations in supply, particularly in where their next projects are going to be. Not the balance of their existing estates, but where they can find land and the cost to produce that and so forth. If they have to wait several years between holdings and development, they're running businesses. They actually charge what they can for the blocks of land. One of the things that's, and if you looked at the average size of blocks, 350 to 600 square metres makes up about 70% of dwellings, new lot registrations in this area for the last 3 years on average. Now, one of the things that Moreton Bay isn't is relatively competitive to other areas. I think it needs to be, with more supply, this would be lower. Some of the developers in the room don't like me to say that, but from the market buying they would, because on the Sunshine Coast, the average price per square metre is $650 per square metre. Moreton Bay, as we've said, is $640. Logan is $530. Ipswich is $450. Now you could argue that they're low because they're in Ipswich and Logan, but the market again is looking for affordability and solutions, and the Gold Coast is even $655. So one of the challenges that some people tell me when they're actually looking at buying property, particularly first home buyers, say, well, they use the word it's not cheap. You don't want to be cheap, but you want to offer value for money. So it's one of the challenges as well, is that in growth markets, you're not top of the pops. Maybe you shouldn't be, but that's an issue, I think, moving forward. Let me talk about development trends now that are taking place. Now, this took a lot of forensic work. What I've just talked about is generally available if you know where you're going. It's publicly produced. It's not necessarily in the same form that I've delivered, but you can find that out. For this section of this talk, I've actually gone into some pretty deep analysis. I've read previous studies. I've searched a lot of excuse me, applications and so forth, and some of these trends were surprising when I actually did this work. So I'm going to call this what I call real action. So what's really happening? Part one. 75% of the applications into Moreton Bay City Council are for small developments. So the activity that the council sees are small projects, usually under 10, sometimes under 20 dwellings in one development. So they see a lot of that activity. But the reality is that 80% of the dwellings are actually provided in major projects. So that's a big thing. So over the last 3 years, of the 10,000, out of the 12,500 dwellings that have actually been put an application in the council, 10,000 of those, and in terms of delivery of allotment registrations and action, 70% have been in big projects. So big subdivision, master plan communities and the like. So the facts of the matter is that the big things deliver most of the housing in this area and so forth. You could argue that's going to change. I'm going to argue that I don't think it is. The market will go somewhere else because the development opportunities will be there. The second reality is that 70+% of all the things that are registered are actually taking place. That's different from an approval, because if you get an approval, you know, about my experience, 50-60% don't happen in any time soon, particularly if it's apartments or townhouses. But if you look at the things that are actually being commenced and built, 70% of them plus are detached homes. So, a lot of activity in the small end of the market, but it doesn't add up much growth, dwellings, at actually only 20%. And the major supply of dwellings and new housing is in major projects. If I review then the potential sites in the area, and that's everything that the current plan in the council says is right open for development. So it's not just major parcels, it's everything in that area. It finds that 45%, so this is number 3, issue 4, is that 45% of that land is suited to attached and only 55% are detached. Maybe that's not poles apart from this, but it is different. You could say over a period of time people will live in more detached homes. Not if those demographics are the shapes that are forecast that I believe are happening. And when you ground truth, you can see it. First home buyers, upgraders, major drivers of markets. There's some downsizing and so forth, but there's not enough to drive that supply. This is out of balance. Okay. Number 4, get these figures right. Sorry. Pardon me. See, it's early for me. 45% and 55%, just so we keep these on the board. That's detached, that's attached. And then if I look at the unlikely projects, let me explain this for a second. What I do when I analyse supply, and a lot of people don't do this, they just say, oh, there's X number of dwellings approved. You know, it's often said there's 5,000 dwellings approved in, say, Moreton Bay area, and there's a lot of supply. Well, I review all of those supply and I look at ones that are likely to happen, i.e., well, are going to happen, they're under construction, likely to happen. They've got a DA and they're making moves to do something. They've got a development application, that's possible. They're under design concept, that's possible. And then there's a range of things that actually stop projects, and this is the unlikely project lump. They're going to appeal. There's sites for sale. They say the project's abandoned. They haven't paid any of their consultants. In other words, they haven't got any money. Because developers, my experience, largely pay their bills unless when they can't. Or it's I think I said abandoned. There's a range of things. So when I've reviewed the last 3 years of all applications for new development in this area, including them right down to block splits to major developments, I found that only 3% of the detached house market, in terms of dwellings, this is in terms of dwellings, not applications, but total dwellings, are detached, and I think it's 27% are attached, so townhouses and units. So a quarter of the things that are infill, downtown, small blocks, next to railway stations, blah, 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 or next to townhouse developments near parks and so forth, a quarter of those are now unlikely to proceed, as my count was about a month ago. But only 3% of the detached house supply is constrained. And the last point here, before we do a bit of wrap up and take some questions, is that when we look at the small projects versus big projects, make sure we get the right figures. The large projects, only 7% of the stock is stopped or unlikely to proceed, and this is 35%. So a third of the small projects are unlikely to proceed. So here we've got a market that most of the supply is in big things, master plan communities, major subdivisions, and the like. Where is the land to provide that moving forward? Most of the market wants and has been delivered detached housing, and that is still in demand. And I believe will probably, in contrast to, say, Brisbane City Council, where it has a different demographic shape, will increase in demand in the future. Things are stalling already because of economics of development. Most of those are in the detached market, and they're actually in smaller projects. So let me wrap up, and we'll take some questions. So one of the things that is, I'll drop this off. One of the things that's happening in this market, you're not alone here in this region, but the other areas have an advantage in that they have supply in larger arrangements than is currently available here. And the mindset, unfortunately, is at odds with the demographics and the delivery of actual projects. And that is small infill, multiple little projects, apartments, townhouses, and even then, when it comes to detached housing space, higher yields than actually the market will bear and the developer can actually supply in terms of making money. There's a site price involved in that as well, where reality is that the market's delivery is large projects, it's very price sensitive, it needs to have certain things in place. Then if I take a deeper look where the land is available in this area, a lot of it is in fragmented ownership. So it's in, like the tables here, and that table wants to sell and that person wants to sell and that person wants to sell. and Trask at the back wants to buy them. But they really need those 4 tables at the back to make that economically work. But that table there, which is a smart table because it's got the councillors on it and so forth, they actually ask for $5 million rather than the $1 million that they want. And that's a vital piece of land because that's where the trunk main sewer is going to go. Okay? That project now doesn't start till they can actually be realistic or they can buy the rest of the tables. And if that trunk sewer isn't combined with the other developments in the area, who's going to go first? Then it becomes a waiting game, so no development takes place. Then on top of that, there's an overlay from planning. I'm not having a go at planning. This is what happens though. There's an overlay of planning, and I like to keep wild things, and I live in the bush, and I have a place in Tasmania, and I like all those things. But it's not only just wildlife, it's a range of other things that are very restrictive to development. I'm not saying you develop everything to the maximum, but that's what happens. And then there's a yield expectation. Well, we'd like to see 100 dwellings in that area, so that's 40, 50 per hectare. That's not going to work, guys. The market won't bear that. They won't pay the price for that. They want this lot size and so forth. And then, of course, there is a process that is often missing when developers, particularly from overseas or interstate, employ me and they look in places in southeast Queensland, they're a little perplexed at the process of getting an application. You know, they don't mind being told no, or they have to do things, but they like to be told that early and clear without the rules changing and so forth. So there's some challenges facing the market supply here. It's mainly because of where the land is, its lack of coordinated infrastructure, and its price that might be associated with it. But so they're physical things, but there's also an overlay of planning and regulation that needs some thinking. You don't have to do it. I don't care, to be honest. But if you don't do it, I don't know anything, but I suspect, in fact, I will tell myself in the mirror, this will happen, is that you'll have less development, your jobs won't be growth won't be as strong, and people will start to go where those development opportunities are, where those jobs are, and where housing, as a result of the supply, because all real estate is demand and supply, where that supply meets that demand and that the prices stay reasonable for those people to purchase. So thank you for listening.